I'm going to cover a couple of scenarios as well as some of the basics of the ASPxGridView. I'm going to cover data binding to a large data source, and I'm going to do this using the link server mode data source. Then I'm going to cover a particular topic that's actually it's a demo that's really interesting because it shows how to use a template as well as make it dynamic. So for example, if there's a lot of data to show, we're going to use a data cell template to use and a pop-up control to show the extra amount of fields. Now, I ask your forgiveness because I'm a little bit under the weather. I don't think it'll affect it too much, but anyways, the good news is we have the complete ASP.NET Brain Trust from DevExpress here. So we've got some of the top support guys, for example, Plato, Vest, Max, everybody that you know, Serge, as well as a couple of the actual devs from the DevExpress ASP.NET team. So feel free to ask any questions that you like. We'll be happy to answer them. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to data bind to an ASPxGridView large data source. Now, I'm assuming at this point that most of you probably have some experience with ASPxGridView. If you do not, and if you want me to cover some of the more basic concepts of just data binding and setting up editing and so forth, I'll be happy to do that. So go ahead and put that in the questions or in the chat window, and I'll go back and cover it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to data bind to this table here, the server mode grid projects. Now, if you've ever used any of our WinForms or even maybe some of our ASP.NET large demos, you'll see that we use this table quite a bit. So just to show you, this is a pretty large table. Oh, okay, so for some reason this count is taking forever, but I'll show you this in Visual Studio. And generally there's about, I think, 300,000 records or at least 100,000 records in there. To do this, I'm just going to start with new web forms project. So I'll start with a new empty ASP.NET web application. Call it ASPxGridView large data source. Now, this feature that I'm going to demo is it uses what we call the server mode feature. And I'm going to explain that in just a bit. So the very first thing I'm going to do is obviously, while CodeRush is looking at the items here, I'm just going to add a default pager. Now, excuse me. The first thing that we want to do is actually we want to use link. Now, there is an option to use XPO. Just so you guys know the difference, let me just bring up DevExpress.com here. So XPO is our ORM that we've had for many years, and it can talk to several databases, and it's had this fantastic feature in some of the other platforms like WinForms, and a couple of years ago we ported to ASP.NET. And what it does essentially is it pushes the work of doing querying onto the back end. So what happens is when we get data from this table, we are actually going to generate a query similar to this, and this is going to be executed on the back end. Normally what happens with most standard data sources in ASP.NET, that entire data set, regardless of how big the table is, gets pulled onto your web server, and then whatever operation you need to do to it occurs on the web server. And that's highly inefficient because you have to pull a lot of data between the database and the web server, as well as it doesn't scale because it increases the memory footprint of your web server. So we're going to use this server mode feature, which generates that query and only gets the records that we need to display. So the very first thing is, since I'm going to, as I mentioned, you can use XPO. And if you were going to use XPO, you can simply just go File, New File. Sorry. Let's go File, Add New Item. And you can add a new XPO class in here somewhere. Where did it go? Express persistent object classes. So we can use XPO, but I'm actually going to use link. Link works just the same, works just as fast. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to data and add a link to SQL class. Now I'm just going to call this my DB model, but you might want to name it something more particular to whatever it is that you're representing. So for example, I know that this is the server mode grid test, so you might want to name it something like that. Now, while link to SQL Designer comes up, let's give Visual Studio just a minute here. One thing I want to mention is that this server mode technology, when do you use this versus, let's just say, standard data source? Are there limitations? Well, the first guidance I'll give you is whenever you have a large amount of data, anything about, let's say, 100,000 records or more, then you should really consider the server mode feature, because that's where you're going to get the most benefit out of it. If your table just has a few thousand rows, you're okay using a SQL data source because there's not too much being taxed on your web server in that instance. So here's our link to SQL Designer. This is where we can drag entities on here, and this is the methods pane. So you can actually use even store procedures with link to SQL. So I'm going to go to Server Explorer here, and I can see that I have a previous connection here to my server mode grid projects. I'm using a local instance of SQL Express. So you simply, if you don't have this connection, you can simply just right-click, add a new connection, etc., etc. So I'm going to drag this entire table, this entity, and now it's here on my link to SQL model. I'm going to hit save, and I'm going to compile, because what this is a class representation of the actual table in the database. And for my project to recognize it, I'm going to have to make sure that I compiled it and saved it. So as you saw right there, we built it successfully. So now I can go back to this default page. Now I'm going to add an ASPxGridView here. You can find it under DX 10.2 data. Now you can drag and drop it, or just double click it and that'll drop it as well. Now, as you saw, this web config pops up and you'll see little things happening here in the server solution explorer. Let me explain what just happened. A couple of releases ago, we started using an ASPX HTTP handler for performance reasons and for delivering our themes, as well as catching callback errors. It does a lot of fantastic things. So when you drop one of our controls from the designer, you're going to see that the web config gets modified, and you'll see this section added. Now, even if you use the project converter, you'll see that these are all basically DevExpress specific settings. For example, we now support right to left. These are all the performance enhancements. For example, enable HTML compression, callback compression, resource compression. Now, callback and resource compression are enabled, and what that means is a callback is compressed. So when now I'll get into callbacks a little bit later. So if you're not familiar, don't worry. I'll talk a little bit about callbacks. Now, resources are anything like images and scripts and so forth. Now, we also have resource merging. So for example, let's say you're using a button as well as a grid view on the same page. Well, they'll have different script files. Excuse me one second. By the way, if I'm talking too fast, let me know. I tend to get excited about this stuff and talk very fast. So resource merging allows us to merge, for example, scripts, so there's less requests being sent to the server, hence giving you more performance. Now, by default, you might ask, well, why is this set to false and why are some of these set to true? We've enabled these settings for the greatest reach of browsers. As you all know, each browser has its own, idiosyncrasies. We are very cross-browser compliant, and therefore, we support everything from IE6 to Mozilla Firefox to Chrome to Safari. So, we also basically leave this up to you in case you wanted to use some more performance enhancements. So when you first drop that on there, you'll see that things start happening, references get added to your project, and so forth. Now, we need to add a data source. Now, we can go to the standard Microsoft data sources, find them under data here, and you'll see that there is the link data source, and I mean, we can completely use the link data source with the ASPxGridView. However, the ASPxGridView that uses the link server mode data source has advantages. Now, I can drag and drop this, or double click to drop it on my form. I can use this smart tag. So I'll click this little thing here, this little smart tag, which brings up this smart tag menu that allows you to do some common tasks. And here I can choose the data source, and I'll click New Data Source. And this will bring up the data source wizard that will allow me to choose which data source I want. And as I mentioned, we can choose everything from Access database to SQL data source to link data source, but I want the link server mode data source. So I'm going to select that and hit OK. Now at this point, you don't see anything bound to the ASPxGridView. And that's because I haven't really set up the link server mode data source. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the properties, click link server mode data source, and here I'm going to set the context type name to that data context that we created. So as you remember, it's now pointing to this data context. And if you want to see, here's the actual data context that we're pointing to, and the columns that it's representing from the database. So let's go back to our default ASPX. Now, in the link server mode data source, I also need to pick the table. Now, I only had one entity that I pulled in, the server side grid test, but if you had multiples, you can choose those as well. Now, as far as guidance, you can actually have multiple, how do I put this, multiple models, right? So for example, you don't have to pull in all the tables. You should only pull in what you're going to use. Now at this point, I can also set up things like deleting, inserting, and updating. So let's say I was going to allow editing, so I'll set the enable update to true. Now here, here the ASPxGridView has picked up on those fields from that entity. So if I'm going to go back to the smart tag, and first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the columns editor here. Now this ASPxGridView columns editor allows you to do all sorts of things. For example, I can hide, for example, the OID, which is the primary key column. Let's say I don't want to show the optimistic log field. I can remove that. I can do things, all sorts of things to the column. For example, its behaviors, depending on what type of column it is. I can make it into a combo box. I can make it into a binary image, a spin edit. And for example, if you wanted to change here, I could add any one of these type of column: hyperlink column, memo column, progress bar, text, time edit. As you can see, there's a ton of options. So one thing I also recommend is that you can also change the caption. So instead of saying has attachment, you can put something like attachment. Now, let's just take a quick look at this in action. So I'm going to hit Control F5, which basically is running the project without the debug mode. All right, so I've got a little error here. Let me just check what's going on. Yes. Okay. So give me 1 second. I'm using a dev build, a more recent dev build than probably the 10.23 that you might have. So I ask just 1 second. I need to add. Oops. So I'm simply going to pull in a reference to devexpress.data.link here. Now, I promise you, you do not have to do this. It's simply because I've got a different build than you, and if you like, I welcome you to try this on your end as well. So let me just go here under DevExpress. dot data. Where did it go? Okay. All right. So ignore what you just saw right there, because I promise you, you won't need to do that. So let me run this again. So I'm hitting Control F5, which, as I said, is just another way to run without the debug mode. And I find that without the debug mode, sometimes it loads, not sometimes, it does load faster because it doesn't have to jump into that debugger. Now, here, what we've done is we've bound ourselves. So we have here about 10 rows for the grid view that we're displaying, and 50,000 pages, which means we have 500,000 records in that table. So let's say I was going to go from this page to the second to last page, right? As you saw, it took literally less than a second. And the reason that is the link server mode data source. When I click this link here, it says, give me this slice of data, which is these records from here to here, and it's smart enough to calculate, okay, get it from this page to this page, and give that query to the back end. The SQL server, which is optimized to execute these queries, will execute it lightning fast than the web server would, and then I'm only getting 10 records across the wire, which means that this is very scalable. So you might think, well, okay, paging is just fine, but across different operations, for example, sorting, as well as grouping, you'll find that the operation is just the same. So let me enable grouping here. Now, excuse me. You'll see that in the smart tag here, you can do a lot of things like, as I said, I've enabled editing, so I can click the enable editing. Now you can do some things like enable filtering. Now when I do that, what happens is I get this header filter. I'm actually not going to use that one because there's another one, another filter option that I really love that's very powerful. So I'm gonna show the group panel. Now, as a bit of guidance, I always recommend that if you don't need a particular option, don't enable it, because what happens is with each option that you enable, it's going to require perhaps some more scripts or so forth. So the ASPxGridView will only download what it needs. So for example, if you enable everything, it's going to download a bigger script, which means that it'll have to load up a little bit more. So just as a bit of guidance, just use what you need. Now, let me also change the auto format, which is basically the theme here. Now, starting with 10.2, we introduced this new DevEx theme. I really like this theme. It's based on our demos. It's nice and clean. It's got these nice little buttons. So let's just hit OK there. And now let's take a look at this in action. I'm gonna hit Control F5 again. So, all right, sorry about this again. We'll just chalk that up to a demo daemon. So now, when the ASPxGridView loads up in server mode, it's going to show us the new theme of the DevExpress. As you can see, it's got a little gradient here, as well as some nice little icons and some buttons. So as you can see, the server mode still works with editing as well. And if I do grouping, you can see that it's also going to work. Now, is server mode optimal in all cases? Yes, it is, and no, it is not. So for example, let's say I had enabled filtering here. Let's just do that to kind of show you. Because what's actually happening is we're passing the work onto the back end, right? So let's enable filtering here. Sorry about this. So while that loads up, what's happening is the query is generated and it's being passed to your SQL server, which means that you can still get yourself in trouble. So for example, let's say I was just going to find all the attachments where it's checked. Okay, no problem at all, right? So we went down from 500,000 records to almost 200,000 here, right? So I'm going to choose that back here. But what if we did a wildcard search in here that says find me everything that starts with like menu here. Now what's going to happen here is that it's actually doing a wildcard search on the subject field, which is a long string field. And as you can see, it's taking a little bit longer. And that's because the database is taking a little bit longer. So in some instances, you could get yourself in trouble. And theoretically, maybe you could add an index, but normally you wouldn't add an index to something like a long string field, right? So my suggestion is that as powerful as server mode is, that it comes down to how fast your database is, right? Now, of course, I'm running this on SQL Express, and maybe on a full development database server, it would be much faster. But just know that you may want to keep certain things like this in mind. Now, you could also individually turn off some of the filtering options for some of these columns. Now, let me go back here, and I'm gonna just show you. Instead of using this filtering, let me show you the filter control. Now this is a fantastic control because it uses real English languages that your end users can generate. Now, if you haven't got a chance, I highly recommend checking out all the properties of the ASPxGridView. A lot of how the ASPxGridView gets set up is in this settings block here. So here, under settings, under show filter bar, I'm going to set it to visible. Now, what you saw here is this little filter bar shows up here, and it just says create filter here. So let's see what that looks like. All right. Amanda, I'm gonna reboot Visual Studio really quick. Can you hang on?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So while Mehul's rebooting Visual Studio, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what's coming up. Tomorrow we have a webinar on XAF with XAF evangelist Gary Short. It's What's New in version 2010, Volume 2. That wraps up our week tomorrow at 10 a.m. and a peek into next week. Monday, December 13th, developer evangelist Steve Andrews is introducing DevExpress MVC extension, so that should be a good one. And Tuesday, December 14th is a double whammy, using CodeRush in XAF with Mark Miller and Gary Short. They reveal how to accelerate your XAF development with CodeRush. And we have a whole new lineup of webinars rounding out 2010 and into 2011. So check them out at devexpress.com/webinars and register online today. Looks
Thanks,
like
Amanda. All right. Yeah.
All right.
So I think we are set here. And I know the devs are online right now, and they're looking at what I'm doing here, going, no. So sorry, guys. This is just a demo daemon, and we'll leave it at that. Okay. So I'm just about done with this demo, anyways. I just want to show you that filter control because I know it's running late already. Because that second example I'm going to show you is a little bit more complex, a little bit more involved. However, there's some great things to learn out of that. So. As I mentioned, I got rid of the header filter, but I think this is a much better option for your end user. So when I hit create filter, what I get is a pop-up. And as you can see, it's in modal mode here, right? And now I can hit this plus sign and generate a filter. So here, I'm going to say something like, give me everything where the size is greater than, let's just say 3,000. And I'll hit OK. Now, as you can see, it is smart enough to know, based on the size column here, that it went and figured out that I can only enter in a specific value. Now, as you can also see, I can have multiple versions of this, so I can enable and disable individually. But in this case, I think I'm going to just add to this one here. So let's add another option here. And let's say something like sent. Now here, we can say it's sent and pick a date. Now as you can see, these editors that are generated are smart enough to know that this is a date field, and so you should only pick a date field here. Now, I don't think there's any items in here from today, so, but as you can see, the create filter is a fantastic option. So I will pause for a second here, and if anyone has questions, feel free to ask.
We do have some questions. Let's
Yes.
see. Walter asked, well, let's see, someone may have answered this. Could you show somewhat slower how to add the filter control? That's something you just.
Hey, Amanda. Yes. Give me 1 second, okay?
Okay. While we're waiting on Mehul, I just wanted to note that we have, since we released 10.2 on the DevExpress channel at tv.devexpress.com, we have released over 70 new tutorials, which is the most we've ever released for a new 10.2, and you should check them out because there's a whole lot of new stuff that you can be learning how to use all the new features that came out with 10.2. So tv.devexpress.com. We've got up over more than 70 new tutorials up.
Hey, Amanda.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. So what was the question again, if you don't mind?
Walter asked, can you show somewhat slower how to add the filter control?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so you can do one of two things here. So I can do enable filtering here. Now we have several filter options. So enable filtering gives you that header filter row, right? There's also a column filter option. However, in fact, let me just show you that. And the best way to check these out is just go demos.devexpress.com brings you here, and you can simply go to the ASPxGridView, which will take you to our nice and snazzy new demos. And if you go to filtering, you can see all the different filtering options. So filter row is that one that's created from the smart tag. You can just click enable filtering, and it gives you this, which is nice. You know, you can type in something like ch or ch%, and it'll start getting everything that starts with ch. And there's also the header filter option. So here I can click on this, and it gives me all the unique values for this column. So I can say something like, show me only Alfreds here, and you can see it gets me only Alfreds. And then I can further customize this and say, well, show me only the $10 items here, right? So this is not a bad option either. The filter control is the one that's probably the most powerful because it allows your end users to fine-grain exactly how to define it, because it uses common English terms here, right? So I want to say quantity is greater than 100, or order date is between this date and that date, etc., etc. So, and the way I enable that is I went to the ASPxGridView's properties. Under settings, I set the show filter bar to visible. Now, if you wanted any of the other options, then you can use the show filter row as well. However, as I recommended, I kind of tend to lean towards maybe one or filtering option, right? Because the grid can do a lot. You don't want to confuse the users too much. I mean, it all depends on what features they're looking for. So I'm sorry. I hope that answered the question, Walter.
I'm sure he'll let us know if it didn't.
Okay.
Somebody asks, can we have header filter capability, but on the filter row, i.e. the drop down on one column can be either from a data source or from smart header filter feature?
Okay, if I understand them right, they want to have a header filter capability on the filter row. Okay, it's kind of unusual, right? So for example, filter row allows you these text boxes, right? So if they're talking about merging the two, I'm not sure. I mean, we can give it a try. So for example, you can have filter row by enabling the filter. Then let's go and set the filter row menu to true as well. So in short, the answer is kind of yes, right? So as you can see, we got the filter row menu that does that, as well as the filter row.
Cool. She says yes. And Walter also said you answered his question.
Excellent.
We have a really kind of a long question. Let me see if I can find it again. Andre asks, I've discussed this with support, but I'd like some live feedback discussion. Say we have a table with a lot of posts. I want to create some kind of permission system. For example, user A is only allowed to see posts with certain values. Today, we've implemented this with stored procedures that take a user ID as a parameter and selects filtered data that the specific user has access to. In Entity Framework and Link, I can attach stored procedures to insert/update/delete, but I can't find a way to attach a stored procedure to select and provide it with a user ID. How would you guys go about and design this? I don't need details, but a general idea.
Okay, I think somebody in the back channel has
answered this.
Yeah, and if you want a little bit further clarification about that, because it seems like a very specific scenario. So in general, can you do that? Yes, you can. Okay, I think what he's asking for specifically is his instance, right? So just remember that the grid is a user interface control, right? Now we are using a specific data source technology. However, the grid itself is a user interface control. So it provides you all sorts of eventing and so forth. For example, before a row is even displayed, you can do things like check, okay, well, if this guy is a certain user ID, I don't want him to be able to edit the row. Or if the value of the row is so-and-so, don't display the edit button, right? So there's all sorts of things you can do permission-wise in terms of, what capability you provide per user. I hope that makes sense, right? I mean, as I mentioned, at the end of the day, this is a user interface control, and it's completely customizable, as you can see from all the eventing and so forth.
Cool. That's all the questions thus far.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'll move on. Excuse me one second. All right, so I'm going to start a new project here. Now, the next thing I'm going to show is a template demo. Let me see if I can bring this up here. So where did it go? Here. Okay, so this, if you look under templates, we have several examples. This is a common one that we kind of push, and you think, okay, well, what's so special about this, right? Well, what's useful about this is, let's say you have a large amount of data. Because I hear this a lot. Sometimes somebody will say, well, I have a lot of columns I want to show. And general guidance for not just ASP.NET, but with the web in general, because this is all HTML that's being pumped out and sent over, a stateless environment, you want to keep it light and fast, right? So here, we're showing 6 rows. However, there's more data to show. So what we did in this demo is we used the data item template of this column to add a link. And when we click the link, a pop-up comes up that shows more data. Now, when that pop-up came up, you see the little loading icon? What's happening is it's doing a callback. So this information is only loaded when I click this. So therefore, it keeps this web page light and fast. So I'm going to show you how we do this. And there's some really important concepts. Now, templates in general are just a way to extend anything in ASP.NET. So templates is a ASP.NET, how do I put this, concept, and it allows you, when we, in one of our controls, expose a template. For example, here, this is the pager template, and we've customized this pager template to allow to show a drop-down as well as some custom buttons. Now, when I click this, I have some custom actions with those buttons. What's great about this is I can completely set how this pager looks while still being within the grid. And you can do this for everything into how the edit form looks. So for example, if you don't like the way the edit form looks, you can use the template in the edit form. And here, we are using a tab control to show a really large field, notes, in a separate tab, and showing these items, the regular editors, in the first tab under info. So as I said, we expose a lot of templates. But I think this one has some important lessons here, the cell template. So let's take a look at this. To start, I'm going to create another empty web application. Okay. All right, while that loads up, that code rush there. Hang on one second, Amanda. I just got a little bit of browser issue here. Okay, now we're good to go. So I'm going to add a new page here, add a new item, and just call it default again. So what I usually recommend is whenever you see an example like this, and I probably haven't covered it before, is if you haven't seen the video yet, we've changed our demos design, right? So before we had a drop down up here that allowed you to select the theme. So we moved that here, so you can change the theme to any of the new Office 2010 themes. And excuse me. And if you want to take a look at the code, simply go to the code tab here, and you'll find everything from the ASPX, the C#, and even the VB version of the code if you're into VB.NET. So in this example, if you were to just take a look at the code, you might be a little bit intimidated. I don't think you should be, and that's what we're going to cover, right? So the very first thing is I'm going to cover, let's just start off with the grid view, and you can see it's just bound to some fields within the Northwind database. Now, if you've seen most of our demos, you know that Northwind is pretty popular. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a ASP.NET folder here. I'll call it app data. And to app data, I'm going to add an existing item. If you ever want to use app data for yourself, you can simply go to, actually, let me show you from the local C. Go to C on Windows 7. It's C:users public documents, and here's where you find all the demos, and all the source code for the demos is there as well. So feel free to open these projects, play with them. And I'm going to components, ASP.NET, under ASPxGridView, C# app data. I'm going to find this Northwind MDB file. I'm going to add that, and when I hit add existing, it actually makes a copy of that to my local folder here. So same as before, I'm going to drop an ASPxGridView on the pager. And while that's loading, okay, so let's just go to the design view. And as you can see, the web config gets modified as usual. Now, I don't know if you noticed, by the way, that if you stay in source HTML view, some of it might not kick in until you actually go to the designer, or perhaps if you use something like the project converter. Now, let me just quickly cover the project converter. In our installation, we release a lot of tools. So if you go to DevExpress 2010.2 components tools, you'll find things like if you use SharePoint, this SharePoint register is very good. This theme deployer, I'm actually going to cover in this demo. And this project converter. Now, there's these other things like version checker, toolbox creator, and so forth. The project converter is really useful when you are changing between major and minor versions. So here I have 10.2.3 installed. However, if I was upgrading from 10.1, what I'd want to do is I'd want to use this project converter. Now, one thing I do is I always add this project converter in my project here. So I'll go to Tools, External Tools in Visual Studio, and here I'll just add a new item, and I'll call it DX Project Converter, and I'll point it to this location, which is under Components, Tools, Project Converter, and I'll pass the argument as the project directory. Now, what this lets me do is, let's say I'm in this project and it was 10.1, and I'm actually upgraded to 10.2. I can simply go to Tools, DX Project Converter. It will automatically point to this project that I'm in and allow me to upgrade it. So usually, I'll just simply remove this Create Backup Files option, and I'll hit Upgrade. Now, since there's nothing to upgrade in this instance, I'll just close it. But that's a great way to upgrade between major and minor versions. Now, I'm going to use the Smart tag here, and I'm going to add a new data source. And because I'm just using Access Northwind here, I'm going to use the Access data source. By the way, I'm sorry if I went too fast. I just clicked on the Access data source, and now it's asking me to point to the Access data file, which is in my app data, Northwind MDB. I'll click Next. And now I can choose the folder. Now, in this case, I want to get at the Employees table. That Employees table has pretty much all the fields that I want, like last name, first name, photo, etc. So things like the photo and the notes, we're going to be showing that on the pop-up. Now, by the way, Amanda, I've got the back channel kind of hidden, so if there's something specific, you know, if I'm going too fast or anything, just let me know. We'll save the questions for a little bit later, but, you know, in case there's any technical difficulties or something, just jump in and let me know.
Okay.
So because I want to show photos, actually I want all the fields here, but because I want to get items that have the photo, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick items that only where the photo field is not null. I'm going to add this to my SQL expression here. So now I'm going to get everything from employees where the photo field is not null. Just quickly test it, make sure I got enough data here, and hit finish. Now I got the information that I want. However, way too much information to show here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove several of these items here. And let's just take a, let's remove employee ID. Let's move first name up. Let's remove title of courtesy, and perhaps address. Everything actually after hire date. And we're going to be taking and showing notes and photo in a different thing. Now, if we wanted, we could show that in the field here. But what I'm trying to show you is that it's perhaps better to save some of this information and show it on a pop-up. So let's remove this. Keep the notes field. Now, I don't actually want to show the notes field, so I'm going to set its visible property to false because it's going to be a very long field. So let's see, we got first name, title, notes, last name, title of courtesy. Okay, I think, yeah, I don't want title of courtesy. Yes, and that's it. Now, I do want to add one other field. So I'm going to add a new field in here at the very bottom. I just want to make sure the visible, so one of the things you'll notice is some of the visible index fields here are I didn't reset them. So what I'm going to do is I'm just simply going to set this to a high number here, something like 20. And I'm going to give this is going to be now my other field. So if we take a look at this demo here, this is going to be this new field, and we're going to call it details and add a hyperlink to it, right? So as you can see, it's empty right now. So we'll go back to the columns editor here. I'll call it details. And now I can go into the templates. Now, in the best way to get at the templates is through the Smart tag. So in the Smart tag area, as you saw already, you can get at things like the columns editor, as well as take a look at the client-side events, configure the data source, pick a theme, and so forth. If you go to the very bottom here, there's some great links, for example, like support and looking at the client API documentation. But the templates allows, when I click this, it takes me to this other mode here. Now, if you look at this drop down here, this shows you all of the available templates. And as you can see, there are a ton. So everything from the header to the data row to the templates and so forth. Now, I want specifically to change the data row template for the last column. Now, there's a difference. For example, the data item template allows me to change the template for when the data is shown. Now, if this was for edit mode, I'd want to use the edit item template. So in this case, I'm just going to use data item template. And here, I'm going to add a little placeholder because I actually like to do this in the source view here. Now here, I'm just going to add a little hyperlink here. And this is the thing that is going to say more info. Now here, on click, I'm going to have a special JavaScript function that I'll be calling. So before I define that, let me just add this item here. More info. Now, the very first thing is I'm going to make this just a clickable link from within this grid view. So I'm going to set this to void. And in the onClick, I'm going to define a specific function which we haven't created yet, but I know what I'm going to call it. So I'm going to call it onMoreInfoClick. And what we're going to do to it is we're going to pass two parameters to it. This refers to the thing we are in, which in this case is the ASPxGridView. So the reason why we're passing this is because we're going to be doing something with the ASPxGridView, and you'll see that in just a minute. Now the other item I want to pass is the actual row that I'm in. So what you want to do is you want to grab the specific ID, and in this case, this is the primary key. And the easiest way to get at this is making these brackets and calling container.keyValue. I've had so many support questions in the forums. How do you get at the primary key? How do you pass it? Well, container.keyValue. It's a fantastic way of getting at it. So now I know that I'm going to be creating this function. So let's go ahead and define that. Excuse me. Now I'm going to create a little section in the head here for that JavaScript. Just call it script and set the type equal to text.javascript. And so here I'm going to create a little variable here to hold the key value, and I'll explain why in just a second. So here's our function onMoreClickInfo, and we know it takes two things. First, the element, which in this case is the grid, and the key value, right? So in this case, let's just call that parameter key. Now, I'm going to actually hold off on defining this, because what I actually want to do is figure out what that item is going to look like. So we're going to come back to this in just a second, and for now it's just a placeholder. So if you take a look, we have most of the framework for how this is going to look. However, now we actually need a pop-up control. And what's happening within the pop-up control is there's actually a callback panel within it, and I'll explain why. So let's start with the pop-up control. To do this, we're simply just going to add a pop-up control. Excuse me here. Go to the toolbox. You can find this under navigation and layout, ASPX pop-up control. And here, I'm going to add some items within this content area of the pop-up control. So the first thing I want to do is I want to add a callback panel, and the reason is I really should move that thing. Okay, so The reason is because it gives us that nice little spinning loading icon. Now, you can take a look. We still have an item within the callback, another content area within the callback panel. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a couple of things in here. And the first thing I want to do is I want to add a binary image. And you can find this in the DX 10.2 common controls. And this is where you find things like the editors. The binary image allows you to hook up to some complex items like a database field that contains an image, and it'll automatically display that for you. Otherwise, normally what you have to do is you have to first convert that item from the database into, save it out to a file, and then display it. But the binary image makes that much easier for you. So, however, I did not place this in the callback panel, and that's where I want it. So let's add this to the callback panel here. And I'm also going to use a standard ASP.NET control, just a literal here, to show the notes information. Now, because I'm going to be calling these items, let me first set up some better names for them. So this we can call, let's say, binary image. And I'm using similar names that we're using in the demo, so that way you guys can follow along. And I'll just call this lit text. And I'm going to be using these names on the server side in just a minute to set up where the data is going to be coming from. Now, let's go back to the view here. And that pretty much looks like a pop-up with a callback panel within it. Now, I do want to set up some client instance names. So let's talk a little bit about client instance, the client-side events of the ASPxGridView and all our ASP.NET controls. So in ASP.NET and in our controls, we provide you a great set of functionality for the server side. A lot of times you just want to do something on the client side. For example, as you see here, we're going to be clicking this button. When I click that button, I don't actually want to go to the server side. I just want to call the pop-up, and that's what we're going to be doing in the client side here. Now, whenever you're working in the client side, the thing to remember is if you're going to be referencing this server control of ours on the client side, you want to give it a client instance name. So for example here, I can call this thing just a grid, and I'll call the pop-up pop-up, and maybe the callback panel, I'll give it a different name. So client instance name for the callback panel will just be callback panel. And now, because I've given them these client instance names, I can refer to them on the client side. So now we have more or less this pop-up setup. Now, I do want to set up a couple of things on the pop-up control. Let me just set a different height and width for that pop-up control. The first thing is, let's set the header text. Sorry. Call this photo and notes. And now let's set the height and width of the callback panel to a little bit different. So that way we're showing a little bit more. So we'll set the height to 100 pixels, and we'll set the width to 320 pixels. So that's big enough to show the picture as well as the text within that picture. So now we can go back to our script here because we've got more or less the foundation. So when we click this button, we're going to be calling this on more info click. And now we can go ahead and finish defining on more info click. So the first thing we want to do on more info click is we're going to call this callback panel. And this callback panel is really the one that loads the items, the binary image, as well as the notes field. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the content of the callback panel to empty. Then I'm going to call the pop-up. Now, as you see, I'm using the client instance names that I just defined. So here, I can now say, pop-up, I want you to show at element. Because the pop-up doesn't display until it's actually called or attached to something where it can show itself. So here, I'm going to be passing it element. And if you remember, element, in our case, is the grid. So the fantastic thing is, when we pass this, it's going to actually pass the coordinates of where we want it to show. So you'll see that in just a minute. And finally, I'm going to set the key value equal to the key that's being passed in. 1 minute, please. Now, you may ask yourself, why do we bother with this value? And the reason is, I need to define another function here that actually does the pop-up shown. Pop-up shown, S-E. And here, I'm going to call this callback panel.perform callback. Now, I'll explain this in just a second, okay? And what's happening here is we have another function. Now, what this function does, excuse me 1 second here. Okay, so sorry about that. Just set up the phone here. So this pop-up shown allows us to define when the callback panel will actually kick off and make that callback to fill in and get the picture. So this binary image and this little text that will have our notes field will not actually get filled in until we say, hey, callback panel, go ahead and make this callback. So this perform callback feature, I'm sorry, not feature, function is called by several of our ASP.NET controls, right? So what happens is, whenever you want to make a callback, and a callback essentially, well, okay, let's step back a little bit here. So whenever you see our ASPxGridView running in most demos, right? So for example, let's say I hit sorting here. When this loading comes up, that's actually doing a callback. And what a callback in ASP.NET is that it's a way to define, hold on 1 second. So what this allows me to do is this callback allows me to have the Ajax look and feel without updating this entire page. So for example, when I go to preview here, this is a complete postback. It reloaded this entire page. However, when I did sorting on this birth date here, it only updated the grid. And it did that using a callback. So to do that, what we have to do is we actually have to define what gets updated. And our ASP.NET controls make it very easy by providing you this perform callback function, so that we can tell the grid or the callback panel to make a perform callback, and then we can also define on the server side what happens within that callback. So it takes the guesswork out for you to figure out, okay, well, how do I do a callback and what's going to happen in there? Because we take care of the hooks for you and what gets updated and all that good stuff. So let's go back here to the callback panel. And if you remember, the callback panel is the one that we're saying is the one that's going to perform the callback. Well, we actually have to define that method on the server side. And to do that, we're going to go to the server-side events of the ASPX callback panel and override the callback method here. And this is the method that we will land in when this perform callback is called. So before I define this server-side method to get that information, By the way, we're very close to finishing. I know we're running a little bit late, but just bear with me a couple more minutes. So um, the perform callback here, actually before that gets done, this pop-up shown is a specific event, and I want it to be called when my pop-up is shown. And the reason is I don't want this callback panel to kick off until the pop-up is displayed. So what I'm going to do is, let's go to the pop-up control here. Oops, let's go to the design view. And if we go to the client-side events of the pop-up control, you'll see there is an event. Now, if you take a look at the client-side event handlers for the grid or the callback panel, you'll find there's all sorts of events and API that we provide. Now, in this case, because I have that pop-up shown event, I'm just going to call it directly so that it says, for this shown event, call pop-up underscore shown. And I'm just going to hit OK. And if you take a look, what it does is basically delegates and says that when this pop-up is displayed, call this function. Now, ideally, we could have just called this directly within without defining this other function. We could have just put that call directly within that client-side event as well. If you want to take a look, you'll find that client-side event right here. Shown is equal to pop-up shown. So now, let's just go ahead and define the last few bits here, which is the callback panel. All right, so, excuse me. In this callback panel, we're going to be updating the binary image. We're going to set its value property. And we're using value because images are usually stored as blobs inside of the backend. Now, I haven't defined this yet, but I'm going to create a function called findImage. And within it, I'm going to be passing this e.dot parameter. And you're probably asking yourself, what is e.dot parameter? Well, e is one of the arguments, callback event arguments. And this is the thing that we are passing from our callback panel. And here, if you remember, this key value is that ID. So what I'm going to do is say is, using this primary key, find me the image associated with that. Now, we haven't defined this find image yet, so let's just go ahead and define that. Now, to save some time, I'm going to actually use a little bit of cut and paste code, but let me explain exactly what's going on here, right? So in here, in this find image, I'm passing it the ID, the primary key. I'm returning a byte array, which is used by this binary image. So here, you can see I have this data view. Let me just add this using system.data. And what I'm defining here is this access data source, which also points to this same access data source, northwind.mdb here, that's used by my access data source on the GridView. And I'm sending a custom select command, which just says, get me the photo from employees for this employee ID. That's it. Then it's actually using a data view to send that byte array back, which is going to be bound to the binary image. Now, we're going to do the same thing with the literal text to get the notes. So let's set lit text.text is equal to get notes. And once again, I'm going to be passing the e.dot parameter, and I'll set it to straight. Now, this get notes doesn't exist, so let me define that. And once again, And once again, we're doing the same thing, which we're using access data source to simply get the nodes for a particular employee ID. And we're sending that text as a string and binding it to the literal text. So let's see if the project works as we expect. Now everything compiles, and we will see if we can get that information to display. So as you saw, there were several things happening in that demo, right? We added a pop-up control. Within the pop-up control, we added a callback panel. Now, when I click pop-up here, okay. So this is actually a very good thing that I kind of want to show you. So sometimes, occasionally, this will happen, and you'll be confused, like, what happened, right? Well, as you know, we did a lot of things, right? My usual recommendation is step back a little bit and try to see what's going on. Now, this is not really obvious, but what happened is when I was defining this thing, I added by mistake an extra greater than symbol right there, right? And as you can see, within this quote, it's only looking for that value. And if you're curious as to, well, how would you know where to look? My usual suspect is go down, be granular about it. Start from the point where you saw the error, right? So here, I suspected that it was probably on this on more info click. Takes two parameters, and sometimes it's kind of hard to spot because you say, well, how would I spot this, right? You just have to sort of have a keen eye every now and then. Unfortunately, this is, in JavaScript, this is kind of some of the headaches of it. But for the most part, you can usually get it to work without these kind of headaches. So let's take a look at it again. And while that loads up, I'm going to see how the back channel is looking. Okay, so now when I click more info, I should be able to get that picture as well as the notes. Now, as you can see, I probably didn't make my pop-up control big enough, and that's an easy enough fix. I can simply just go and back to the design and make the pop-up control a little bit bigger or something like this. By the way, you can also control the size of the image that's rendered out. So if you don't want such a huge image, you can set a minimum width and height for that image. So now, as you can see, we've got that nice callback panel, and it gives us that nice loading screen, as well as loading the pictures and the notes. So we've kept our grid light and fast, and we've put the relevant information onto the other side. So I am done. Actually, let me show you one last thing that I think you guys may find very useful. Okay. In here, I have several ASP.NET controls. Let's say I wanted to use a theme for them. Now, there's several ways to go about this. Now, let me show you this help topic. Now, this topic, I'll add into the notes somewhere. We get a lot of questions about our themes and so forth, right? So one of the most common ones is, how can I customize a theme? The easiest way is you can click on the smart tag. Let's say if you wanted to make a custom ASPxGridView one. What you can do is you can go to ASPxGridView smart tag, click on View CSS Sample. Here you have all of the styles that we are using. And I can simply go in and say something like Mehul, and you can see what it did was it added a postfix to each of those controls. And now I can simply copy this and put it into my own CSS file and start playing around with it. Change maybe the padding or the colors and so forth. So that's one. Now, in 2011, we're going to be actually introducing a customized theme customization tool that is very slick, and I think you're going to enjoy it. But let's get back to the other thing. If you wanted to customize a page, there's several ways to do it. You can, as you saw, you can do the individual control. However, you can also set it up in the page attribute, or in the web config, or in the code behind. Now, before you do that, make sure you pull in the right themes. And we provide that theme deployer tool to help you do this. So if you go to DevExpress 2010, Components, Tools, and click on ASPX Theme Deployer, this tool helps you decide what you might need. So here, I know that I don't want to select all of them, so I'm going to remove and just select what I want. So I know I'm using things like from the ASP experience, which is the pop-up and the callback, and I'm also using the grid view, but I'm not really using anything else, so I'm not going to pull in everything. Now, I like the DevX theme. Let's say I also want to bring in Black Glass or Soft Orange and Youthful. And now, when I hit before I hit Copy Files, be sure you select where you're going to pull this into. So let's pull the site path into the Visual Studio, My Documents, 2010, Projects, and this is the cell template project. And here, when I select the cell template folder, I'll hit OK and copy files. what it's doing is copying for me the skins and the theme files that are necessary to display those. So now you say, well, where exactly is the folder? Well, what I recommend is click on this little show all files in the Solution Explorer. And here I can see here's the app themes. I'm going to right click, include in project. And that's going to take a second while it loads up those folders. And once it's done, now I can use one of the options here. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to actually use the page attribute and set it to theme. And I believe I have the DevX theme in here. So you go to the top here and say, for all the DevExpress controls on here, I want to use DevX theme. Oops. Now, let's take a look at this in action. And we should see the new DevX theme, not just for the grid, but also for our pop-up as well as the callback panel. And the callback panel, as you remember, we use for this little nice icon. So as you can see, we'll get that for all of our controls. And you can easily change it by changing it to something like, I think it's youthful. So now when I refresh the grid, because I've set the page attribute, it should automatically pick up on that theme. And because I have it imported into my project, it'll simply display that. So now we can get it for all of the controls. And that concludes me speaking for so long. I thank you very much for attending. And I'll be happy to hang around as long as you want to answer any of your questions. So Amanda, let's open it up.
Hey, thanks, Mehul. The back channel, our guys on the back channel are talking about the themes and skins. Do you have access to that chat? They want you to mention to use themes or skins because auto formats are hard to maintain between upgrades and it's hard to read the code.
Yeah. So I believe that's what I just mentioned, right? Okay. So yes. Yeah. So what they're basically what they're mentioning is that you don't have to you don't necessarily have to always go from the auto formats here, right? I use the theme deployer tool to import in the themes that I cared about, right? And then define them using, as I said, I could have easily gone into this system web section. I believe the particular setting is pages theme or something like that. So.
We have a question from Hitendra. How to handle 200K rows in ASPxGridView to get best performance? The list comes from one store procedure via passing center as parameter. Can you show some steps?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me go back to the other project that I had. Large data source. So I don't, who asked that question, by the way?
Hitendra? I hope I'm not demolishing that.
Let's see. Hitendra. Okay. So to answer your question, well, by the way, let me real quick thing about the auto formats versus themes. Themes are better, okay? And I recommend using themes instead of setting individual auto formats on the individual controls. So whenever possible, as a guidance thing, go for the themes, okay? Now, to get back to Hitendra's question, basically, if you remember, I had link to SQL here, right? So if you use link to SQL, you can also, let's see if we have a, I don't think there's any, there might be some store procedures in here, right? So if you have a store procedure, you can use that within link, and you can also use that with our link server mode data source as well. Now, in this case, there isn't much here, right? But you could theoretically pull this in, right, into the designer, into the methods pane here. By the way, if you don't see the methods pane, you can right-click and say show methods pane. Anyways, yeah, so it's completely possible to use a store procedure. I hope that answers the question, Jitendra. And by the way, in the first part, the video of this will be available later. I showed how to hook up with the link server mode data source to the ASPxGridView. Let's go back here. It's really quite easy. And you can also use XPO. However, if you're going to go the store procedure route, you may want to consider link.
Let's see. What other questions do we have? If I set, well, this is another long one. If I set a postfix for a grid, do I really have to copy all the CSS classes, or can I take only a few which I would like to change and leave the others as they initially are?
Yes. Well, okay. The reason why the postfix thing works is because, by the way, hi Monica. It's good to have you. The reason why you don't want to do that is because, let's say here in the ASPxGridView, when you're defining that, let's see, where did it go? Under appearance, CSS class. Here, when you've got that CSS postfix, it might be something like ASPxGridView, as you saw before, Mehul, right? And now I'm using that specific classes, right? So my recommendation is to go ahead and copy the entire set, even if you may not need it. I mean, you could always delete it. However, you may find that some things may not look right. So my recommendation is go with the entire thing. So yes, what she's basically asking is, in this view CSS sample, right? So if she goes something like this, does she need all of these, or can she just pull something like this? Well, the thing is, if you're going to add a postfix, Monica, then you're going to need all of them. If you don't, and you just want to modify this, which I don't recommend, actually, yeah, you probably wouldn't be able to anyway. So my recommendation is add the postfix and then refer to that CSS class directly.
Great. So let's see. We have comments about wanting more beautiful themes. And it looks like, trying to see what questions haven't been answered. Is XPO data source? Yes.
Before you ask the XPO thing, let me make a quick note about themes, okay?
Okay.
Recently, you may have seen this post, DevExpress.com. By the way, this is a shameless plug. If you guys aren't reading the blog, please do. But recently, you might have seen this post about our themes being changed. Let me just show that. Where did it go? Here. No, not that one. And what we did was we consolidated our themes. Okay. We had a lot of smaller controls that had one-off themes. And to consolidate, we want to make sure that when we offer something like let's go back to demos. When we offer something like Office 2010, it's going to be offered for all of the ASP.NET controls. And that is a lot of controls. And every time we add a theme, it's a lot of work because we have to make sure that the image is displayed right in several browsers and so forth. So I just kind of want to put it out there that we would love to keep adding themes. It's just that, it's always a fine balance between adding new features and introducing new controls, as well as, providing themes. So we have some plans next year for at least 1 to 2 themes. And I believe one of them is actually kind of specific for, I believe it was accessibility or something like that. So yeah, we're definitely targeting it, and we'd love to keep adding more. But as I mentioned, that unfortunately it's not a very easy effort to add a new theme, right? Because we're gonna, if we add it we're no longer add it just for, let's say, the grid. We're gonna add it. It's gonna go across all of the ASP.NET suite, which, as you know, is huge. So, anyways, about the XPO question.
Is XPO data source the fastest to use with ASPxGridView?
It is, I would say, as fast as the link server mode data source. So both are, I believe, equally fast. And the reason is internally they both use their smarts. And what I mean by that is, so XPO is our ORM technology. It talks to about 16 different databases, or I don't know how many more. It's extensible, but because we've had it for so long, we knew how to talk to all these databases. So it made perfect sense. When we first released server mode, it was only with XPO data source. And then we introduced the link version for it. So my recommendation is with the ASPxGridView, you get the XPO technology, the ORM. XPO is a very good ORM technology, and if you end up using it, you can do a lot more with it. Now, our other evangelist, Gary, has a lot of videos and blog posts about what XPO can do. And my recommendation is if you're looking for an ORM, go for it, because not only will you get server mode with it, but you'll be getting a very nice ORM technology. And the reason I show link is the question usually is, I have a large database and I need to show X number of rows. Well, link is quick and easy, right? But it's not a full ORM. I don't think it was ever intended to be, or who knows. But anyways, for us, we give you at least two options with link server mode data source and XPO data source. Oh, let me see if I can bring up the I'm sorry, Amanda, was there more questions?
There are two more questions thus far.
Okay, cool. I'll post a link to this, but there's a couple of screencasts that you can watch that cover what I just showed. So I've been showing the link. However, there's also a screencast that shows how to do it with XPO. So with XPO, it's just a little bit different, where you have to add a little bit of code to the global ASX, because XPO has this concept of transactions. So you need a unit of work object, but it's not very hard to create, and we show you all that code right within the screencast.
Cool. Charles asks, are there going to be any code samples and/or tutorials posted regarding the use of link server mode data source and entities?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, we have on our website, if you go to demos.aspxGridView, you can look at XPO server mode here. You can see all of the code for this by going to code. And as I mentioned, it's really straightforward. I would ignore, excuse me, we have some extra things in this demo that show you how long it took. You don't necessarily need that information at all. And as you saw, I skipped it in my demo. What you want to do is simply set up the ASPxGridView, point to an XPO data source, and the only thing else you may need is some code in the global ASX file. Oh, by the way, if you go to tv.devexpress.com, and by the way, I'll post a when I post a blog post that corresponds to this webinar, I'll post links to all of this information as well. Okay, so you can do, I believe, XPO data source. Okay, I'm sorry, maybe not. So maybe server mode, but I'll post direct links to it in the blog post that follows this. So yes, to answer your question, yes, there's all sorts of things like the ASPxGridView, link with server mode, then there's the XPO version, and so forth.
Okay, Marwan asks, does the XPO data source work with the ASPxGridView MVC extension?
Yes, so good question. And there is a video coming. I've been promising the guys. So if you guys have not, and if you're interested, I highly, highly recommend you check out our MVC extensions. So we don't have all of the same breadth of items that we have for all the ASP.NET web forms, but as you can see, we have a really big offering for MVC extensions. And if you go to MVCDevExpress.com under GridView, you'll see data binding to a large database. And this example with the code shows you how you can do something similar to what we just did today. So here, you don't necessarily have the concept of data sources, right? So MVC works very differently, right? But you can see that it does make a call, and within this call, it does some binding. Now, as I said, I'll have a video about it that explains it in much more detail. So to answer your question, yes.
Long story short, yes.
Yes.
Um, let's see. Felix asks, and you may have addressed this. I know that you had GridView for MVC. Does it have all the powerful features, and can I use it with Link?
GridView with okay. Can you repeat that question? I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
He says, I know that you have GridView for MVC. Does it have
Yes.
all the powerful features? Can I use it with Link?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So it has more or less many of the features. You know, we wanted to make sure that when we provided for MVC, that we stuck within that paradigm. Excuse me one sec.
Okay.
Okay, so to answer the question, you can take a look here and look. We got things like sorting, grouping, editing, filtering. So we, you know, in MVC, you might be able to create a little grid and just provide something like sorting. But as soon as you get into something more complex like filtering and editing and row selection, you know, you're not going to get that. And on top, our grid view also has exporting data capabilities. So as I mentioned, we have a lot of features, and this our goal wasn't to make it a feature for a feature and say, oh, let's see what ASPxGridView provides and provide the exact same thing. That wasn't our goal. Our goal was to give you a lot of features while staying true to the MVC paradigm. Because, you know, in MVC, for example, there's the separation of concerns, there's no view state, and it's just a different framework altogether. However, if you're using it, one thing you'll find that is you are going to be writing more code. There really isn't the concept of designer in MVC. So, I mean, you can use it, but, you know, you're not going to be dragging and dropping things onto the designer. So you'll be doing things like, you know, calling a render partial, and, you know, this is how, for example, this is how the grid view is rendered, right? So you have a partial view, which is then called from your main view by calling this render partial method. Now, it's actually not very hard. It's actually simpler in many ways. It's just that previously, as you saw, you know, instead of dragging and dropping things and data binding using the mouse, you're just going to be using the keyboard to write it a little more. And so our goal, we're going to give you as much guidance as we can. And as Amanda mentioned before, Steve Andrews is going to be showing you our MVC extensions next week. And if you're interested, please come and check them out.
Well, that looks like all of the questions. Our guys have answered a lot of them on the back end.
Yeah, the team is fantastic.
Yeah, they are. They are awesome. But I think that we might be able to wrap it up.
I think so. So if I see one question from Jeff, it is the button control. I'm not sure if it's supposed to change colors.
What's a continued conversation he's been having about the
gotcha.
plastic blue theme?
Got you. Okay, well, we'll leave it open for just a couple more minutes so that all the questions can get wrapped up. Once again, thank you very much. I highly appreciate everyone who showed up.
Thank you. I hope you feel better.
Yeah.
You're a real trooper for sticking it out.
Hey, you know, all these people showed up. I can't let them down. So
That's true. That's true. Okay, thanks, Mehul. And yeah, they will obviously stick around and answer further questions in that chat room. I also wanted to mention that DevExpress is proud and honored to have been asked by Microsoft to lend a hand in the organization of the New York City Give Camp over the weekend of January 14th through the 16th, 2011. So it's coming up. Give Camp, if you don't know, is a weekend for software developers, designers, and other technical professionals to give back to local nonprofits in their community. So for more information and to join up, you can visit the Give Camp website, nycgivecamp.org. We will be there. Our DevExpress team will be there. I think Mehul will be there also. And so if you want to join up, please do. nycgivecamp.org. I'll also post it in the chat room. And again, we have one more webinar this week. Tomorrow is the much anticipated Framework Friday with XAF, What's New in version 2010, Volume 2 with XAF evangelist Gary Short. And next week we have DevExpress MVC extension. So for a lot of you on this webinar, that's something you might want to attend. That's going to be given by developer evangelist Steve Andrews. And next Tuesday, December 14th, using CodeRush in XAF with Mark Miller and Gary Short. We have a whole new lineup of webinars rounding out 2010 and into 2011. Check them out at devexpress.com/webinars and register online today. And again, if you missed anything from this webinar or you want to review previous webinars, visit us on the DevExpress channel at tv.devexpress.com. That is also where you will find all of our new tutorials on our 10.2 release, so be sure to check that out. Again, thanks Mehul, thanks developer team, and thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for choosing DevExpress.